Well, looks like the time is 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody. We have looks like the participants are pretty light thus far, but that's to be expected. So I'm sure a few people will come on in, but I just want to welcome everybody. My name's Herb. I'll be your host today. I just have a few reminders before we hand over to Michael and Sarah for the meeting, but welcome everybody to the meeting of the Turlock Subbasin's 2 technical advisory committees. We're using Zoom, obviously, and we're getting real familiar with that. And so if there's any questions or any technical needs, I'll assist those as needed. Also, too, we're going to have public comment on the agenda and on our individual items on the agenda. So feel free and use the unmute feature when that comes, or raise your hand or drop something in the chat, and we'll try and accommodate you through those other technical means the best we can. We're recording the meeting. We'll try and get it up as soon as possible after we're done today and it renders. And then we will be putting any additional meeting materials up on the website as we move through the discussion. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Michael and Sarah for the meeting, and I'll get the agenda up so we can follow along.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Cook. I'm the chair of the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency Technical Advisory Committee. This is a joint meeting the West Turlock folks have with the East Turlock folks, and the chair for the East Turlock GSA Technical Advisory Committee is Sarah Wolf. So we bounce back and forth as we co-chair this meeting. So for the West Turlock GSA TAC, I need 7 members for quorum. And so far, I see me and others from TID, Karen from Ceres, Leandro from Delhi, Miguel from Modesto, Mike Pickcock from Waterford Hickman, Curtis from Hillmark County, and Lacey, can I rely on you from Merced County? I think I can. So with that, I have 7 members, which constitutes a quorum. So I call to order the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee at 2:02 p.m. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. I think you stole one of my people. We need 3 people for the East Turlock to make a quorum. And I think we're okay. I have myself, Sarah Wolf, Dennis Yatsua, and Matt Beeman. And so we have a quorum with those 3 if you've claimed Lacey.
I think
ironically,
Merced counts for both.
Can you wear both hats, Lacey?
I think Merced can wear both hats.
Great, thank you.
And just for the record, I would like to confirm, I believe that we have a member from Houston on the line, Member Velasquez, is that correct?
That is correct.
Very good, thank you so much for confirming.
Jaime, welcome aboard, good to have you. Okay, so with that, we move to item number 3, public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the Joint Technical Advisory Committee on any item of interest to the public that was within our subject matter jurisdiction. Or if you have an agenda item you'd like to address, you can wait until that time or speak on any general topic right now. So with that, the floor is open for public participation. Do we have any public comments? Okay, not hearing any and not seeing any hands raised, I will go to item number 4, which is the approval of the minutes. These are the minutes of the February 24th regular joint meeting, the West Turlock and East Turlock Technical Advisory Committees. And those minutes were emailed out earlier in the week. Do we have a motion from the West Turlock folks to either adopt or amend those minutes?
So moved, Curtis.
I'll second.
Okay, so it's approving the minutes. Thank you, Leandro. So it's approving the minutes of February 24th as submitted. So a motion from Curtis, a second from Leandro. Voice vote or roll call vote, Jennifer?
Voice vote is sufficient for this item.
Wonderful. Okay, so motion moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, minutes stand approved for the West Turlock TAC. Over to you, Sarah, for the East Turlock TAC.
Thank you, Michael. So we also have minutes from the February 24th meeting to approve. Can I get a motion to approve those minutes as submitted?
This is Matt. I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Matt. And a second?
I'll second Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis. And I think we need to do a roll call vote. And I see Christy's on the call now too. So we'll do a roll call vote. Matt Beeman,
Yes.
Dennis,
Yes.
Lacey,
Yes.
and Christy,
Yes.
and Sarah Wolf, yes. Motion carries.
Thank you, Sarah. So moving to item number 5, this is a vote just for the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee. This is a resolution allowing us to continue to hold meetings remotely, consistent with the governor's emergency proclamation and state of emergency. So allow us to continue to remote teleconference our meetings for the period April 4th through May 3rd, pursuant to Brown Act requirements and provisions. Done this a number of occasions, has to be renewed every 30 days. Any discussion on this item? If not, I'd ask for a motion to approve.
So moved, Curtis.
Okay, a motion by Curtis and Hilmar. Do we have a second?
Second, Waterford.
Second from Mike Pitcock. Any further discussion?
Mike, does this one need a roll call vote?
Yes, it does, Karen,
Okay.
because it's a resolution. I just realized what it is. So with that, we have a motion and a second. Jennifer, can you call the roll, please?
Very good. Member Alvarez,
Yes.
Member Juritzma,
Yes.
Member Maldonado,
Yes.
Member McBride,
Yes.
Member McKinnon,
Yes.
Member Pitcock,
Yes.
Member Velasquez,
Yes.
Vice Chair Morgan,
Yes.
and Chair Cook.
Yes. Okay,
Very
that
good, thank you.
resolution stands approved unanimously. Okay, moving on to the fun stuff now. Budget update. This is an overview of revenues and expenditures for the West and East Turlock Subbasin GSAs. And looking at the next budget year, so this would be July 1st, 2022 through July 1, 2022 through June 30th, 2023. We have Michael Clipper from the West Turlock and Sarah from the East Turlock making this presentation. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Okay, I'll start off for the West Turlock. We've had our preliminary numbers for the budget going forward. It's looking like, depending on the size of the of your contribution or the percentage of the West Turlock portion, we're looking at an increase of from 5 to 20 to 25% for the various agencies. The smaller agencies are going to be near the 5% increase over last year. And that's predominantly because the $10,000, and inclusive of that is the $10,000 membership dues. And your portion of the basin activities are very small. And so you have a 5% for your basin increase for your basin activities from last year to this year. And then if you are a larger member like Turlock or TID, you're closer to 20-25%. Any questions on that? If anyone has specific questions on the amount, I can talk to them offline. We will be having probably a meeting. The next meeting, we will be going over these in greater detail for each member.
So Mike, as you finalize those numbers, I know there's a plan, at least for the West Turlock folks, to have, go back to our West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee meetings. I'm assuming we can, delve into those numbers at those meetings and also maybe even email some information out as you get those things firmed up.
Yes.
Okay.
And there's about 10 different line items or so for the various different members.
Right. So I think this is just kind of get the sense this is for planning purposes right now. I know a lot of local agencies, their budget year starts July 1st, and March, April is when a lot of the budget workshops happen for some of the public water agencies and municipalities. So start planning for those increases. Obviously, as I mentioned to the boards, when we adopted the GSP, Sigma is not one of those plans you adopt and put on the shelf. There's a lot of implementation that goes with it, the annual reports, the updates, the monitoring, the model updates, and it will cost money. Michael and Debbie have been working out for the West Turlock folks, and we'll get that information out to you shortly. Maybe Sarah, do you want to take over on some East Turlock stuff, and then we'll have questions at the end?
Yeah, no problem. I was just going to give a balance sheet update for East Turlock. We just had our general board meeting today, so we have updated numbers. But as of February 22, we had $123,102.28 on hand. We approved the payment of $29,918.51 of payables today. And so we will have a balance now at the end of March of $93,183.77. And as to budget planning for next year, East Turlock also has been having workshops and meetings with their TAC on the budget for the upcoming year, working through all of those items that we need to be committed to for implementation of the GSP. And we're working through those and finding areas that we might be able to cut back so that we maintain a budget that fits within the Prop 218 collections that we'll be doing, and both for East Side Water District and for the GSA. And we're getting very close to finalizing those numbers, but it looks that we'll be able to stay within the 218 numbers and have a budget that is able to do all the implementation actions that we're committed to for the 2022-2023 year. And just timeline, we will be bringing that proposed budget back to the ETS GSA in April at their board meeting for hopefully having approval in May.
Thanks for the reminder, Sarah. I think the West Turlock GSA board has a meeting in mid-May. So the goal would be to get to the West Turlock TAC before that, go through the budget, understand it, and make a recommendation for board adoption in mid-May. So I think we're in the same time frame as you. So thanks for the reminder.
Can I add one more thing?
Go ahead, Michael.
Just to give you kind of the accounting for the basin account. Well, the basin account as of today is $670,031.23. And then the bank account for the West Turlock GSA is $186,173.32.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, do you have any questions for Michael or Sarah? Okay, not hearing any. Thank you, you guys. And we look forward, both GSA technical advisory committees working on those budgets to get them ready for board adoption. Okay, moving on to item number 7, the GSP annual report. We'll review and discuss the annual report. We need to submit shortly to DWR. So I'm handing over to Todd. Is that you, Liz, taking this on?
Yep,
okay.
It's me. Thanks, Michael.
Over to Liz Elliott at Todd Groundwater.
Thank you. And if I can, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. You see my screen? Yep, great.
Yep.
All right, well, everyone, thank you for joining today. It's been a while. We have been very busy the last couple months since the GSP was submitted. We have been working feverishly on the annual report. And this is the first annual report for the GSP, and it is due to DWR next Friday, April 1st. So we wanted to show you the results. We are almost done with the report and wanted to show you what we found. So I'm going to be tag teaming this presentation with Dominic from Woodard & Curran. I'm going to start out, give a kind of a brief introduction, and then I'm going to pass it over to him, and then he'll pass it back to me. So let's get started. Okay, so the agenda. I'm going to start out by talking about the reporting period and timing, because this is kind of an odd annual report. It's the first one, and it occurred before the GSP was adopted. And then I'm going to pass the baton over to Dominic at Woodard & Curran, and he'll be discussing the model development and the results. And then he's going to pass it back to me, and I'm going to be discussing additional analyses such as hydrographs, groundwater elevation contour maps, our water quality analysis, and the subsidence results. And then I will end with just a quick discussion of the schedule. So, reporting period and timing. So this first annual report covers water year 2021, which is from October 2020 to September 2021. As you know, we adopted the GSP just a couple months ago in January. And so during this reporting period for this first annual report, the GSP was not yet finished, not yet adopted, not yet submitted to DWR. So during this first reporting period for this annual report, the GSAs were not yet managing the subbasin according to the GSP. And DWR completely understands this. And so, you know, the question is, well, why are we doing this? It's required by law, and we're putting it to good use for several reasons. One is that we're updating the model, and this is what Dominic will be discussing. So the GSP study period ended through water year 2015. So for this annual report, the model was updated for the intervening period. So from water year 2016 through this reporting period for this annual report, water year 2021. So it was a 6-year model update. And we also use the annual report to help us establish baseline conditions for water quality analysis that will be used going forward. And I'll explain this in more detail later. And it also helps us to understand the initial conditions and helps us to work to improve them for the next annual report. So with that, I am going to stop my share and hand it over to Dominic to discuss the model.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you just give me 1 second to get my screen up for you all, I'd love to give you a quick update of what it is that we have done for this most recent annual update. Okay. So if we want to dive right on in to the, let me see if I can get rid of this for you. There we go. Let's try that. So if we want to dive right on in to really discussing what it is that we're updating in the model for the annual update, and really what kind of is effectively the goal of this step. The bulk of it is to meet our regulatory requirements and support the subbasin to develop water budgets for the entire period from 2016 through 2021, but predominantly focusing in on the 2021 water year in order to submit the annual report with and be able to supplement some of the known data with some estimations based on some of our modeling approaches. So really the goal of this is to be able to really focus in and estimate things like groundwater production, which private groundwater production, which are areas where we don't necessarily have groundwater metering, and we can be able to estimate that through a variety of methodology, which I'll go over in a minute. And then eventually, as we look through some of the modeling results, is to look at really what is the kind of the change in storage in our aquifer over the past few years, and that way we can present that to DWR. So overall, the goal for this annual update has been to update the model for the last 6 years, effectively extending a lot of the time series data that we've put into the model. And I'll go over each of those in a second. And then in addition to that, we also want to make sure and perform kind of what we consider a verification step. So effectively what that is we want to take a look at both the water budgets that come out of the model based on the input data, as well as looking at some of the stream and groundwater level hydrographs that the model simulates in order to validate and verify that the model is still doing a good job at representing the basin overall based on the new input data. Now we did want to add this caveat that we are not recalibrating the model. We're not changing anything as far as to the generalized structure of the model, but this is really a kind of an addendum to the data that is existing within the model for our standard historical period, which, if you remember, for the GSP was 1991 through 2015. So now we're going to extend that on another 6 years. So the first step in updating the model is being able to effectively go online and be able to collect any publicly available data, predominantly going to be from state and federal resources. And so really some of the data sets that we are focusing on here is information related to precipitation, evapotranspiration, really, which is a major driver in our agricultural water demand, looking at land use. And then finally, for that last validation step I mentioned a second ago, we also want to make sure we update the model with the observed information, which is groundwater levels and our stream flow data. So if we want to take a look at what some of each of these look like, the first step is taking a look at precipitation. And so it kind of as a quick reminder to everyone, since it has been a couple months since we really looked at some of the model input and output, effectively this is our subbasin. And from a modeling perspective, the subbasin is split into each of what these are considered modeling elements. It's a finite element grid, which is effectively means that the model performs all of its calculations at each one of these intervals from this grid that you see here, and then it's aggregated to the subbasin as a whole for when we want to look at some of the results. And so what that means is that effectively this is the finest resolution of information that we can input data into. So specifically when it comes to looking at precipitation, we can see that we can capture both the temporal aspect of it, which is making sure we capture each kind of monthly step for the basin, but we can also capture kind of a variance across the subbasin, and that would be acknowledging any kind of differences across the basin when it comes to things like precipitation or ET. So overall, we can see that we have a fairly good distribution. You're going to see, there's always going to be, due to kind of the geography of the state, you're going to see some high points and some low points on a spatial scale. But in addition to that, we're also going to see some variance from year to year. We know that there's a lot of variability in our hydrology across the state, and specifically related to precipitation, which is going to be a lot of our major drivers to the recharge within our basin. And we can see here some of the distribution related to what the state dictates as what was known as the water year index. So effectively, this is one of the areas that we're going to report on for the annual report, is to be able to evaluate conditions under each of these water year indexes. So in addition to looking at the spatial component, I also mentioned that we're looking at kind of the temporal variability as well. And what we can kind of see here is that there are definitely going to be what we're considering wetting and drying periods. Particularly if you look at you'll notice that a lot of the times the precipitation in these indices are to a degree related to some of our overall change in storage. You'll see that in wetter periods, when we kind of see some of this, particularly we see some of these higher precipitation charts, kind of the bars that you see here. And you can also see through this cumulative cumulative departure line here in the green is going to reflect some of the wetting periods, which is when this cumulative departure is rising, as well as some of the drying periods that we have here where cumulative departure is going down. In addition to precipitation, evapotranspiration within the subbasin is probably the major driver in our water demand, particularly for agricultural uses. And so evapotranspiration is one of the things that we make sure that we incorporate, and we're able to capture the variability of evapotranspiration both spatially and temporally as well. So you can see here, this is kind of effectively a monthly interval of kind of what we're considering the reference evapotranspiration. And what we do is we can actually look at it at several different locations. And so there are two predominant CIMA stations within the basin. That's going to be here. It's called Denair and Denair 2. And we also wanted to make sure that we can kind of capture some of available gradation from a spatial component by capturing this Modesto station as well. And so from here, we can see that overall, evapotranspiration has been rising over the past few years. And so with that, we're going to see a little bit of growth in our agricultural demand, driven simply to the solar radiation, the temperatures that we're seeing, that have been occurring over the past several years. And so we want to make sure we can kind of capture that change capture that increased demand when it comes to modeling our demand in the subbasin as well. And as I mentioned a second ago, the SIMA stations, in addition to just pure evapotranspiration, also provides temperature charts. And so we can see that the kind of the correlation here with the increased solar radiation as a function of temperature as well. The next major component that we like to evaluate when it comes to estimating the subbasin's overall demand is going to be land use. And what we can see here is the kind of the full time series of what we're considering still the historical model with the extension of this 2016 through the 2021 period, looking overall at land use. Now, land use is predominantly for the Turlock Subbasin is going to be, generally rely on Department of Water Resources land use surveys. They have, they generally every 2 years, the DWR publicly releases on their Sigma portal updates to statewide land use. Now, one of the things you can notice here is that we actually are freezing the 2015 land use moving forward. And the reason for this is that as a group, both some of the consultants putting the modeling together, as well as the ad hoc committee for the GSAs, we evaluated some of the land use and found some existing issues with that data set, predominantly when it came to representation of some of our permanent crops, predominantly our almonds and some of our orchards. Due to some of the uncertainties associated with those with the resources of the information that we get from DWR, it was the recommendation of the ad hoc to freeze the land use at this 2015 level for this annual report when it comes to our representing our land use. This is something that we're considering to reevaluate moving forward, but given the very short time period that we had when it comes to submitting our GSP just a few months ago and to the time we needed to submit our annual report, is kind of due to the limitations and scheduling constraints that we have, we've decided to utilize this, and we're going to reevaluate some of the land use that's in the model moving forward. So if we want to break that up to kind of show you what that looks like on a basis, looking at the kind of the two GSAs, effectively, we can see that continuation, that breakdown of some of the land use categories. Again, we're maintaining the 2015 data going forward, but here's kind of a quick breakdown as to the acreages that you're seeing here. So again, most of our basin is going to be predominantly driven by the water demand associated with our permanent crops, our orchards, as well as our growing of about 100,000 acres of corn in the east and about 20,000 acres in the west as well. So now that we have a kind of a fairly good idea of our overall, at least our agricultural demand, the next step was to take a look at some of the surface water operations that we have and take a look at overall, what do we know about the water supplies within the basin? And so the first step at looking at water supplies is to take a look at some of the water that is measured, and that is predominantly going to be the surface water operations that are directly measured, as well as some of the agency-based groundwater production. So if we want to take a first cut at looking at some of our surface water operations, the goal of this extension of the model time period was to collect data from Turlock Irrigation District, Merced Irrigation District, and the State Water Resources Control Board to be able to extend that time series again through 2021. And so what you can see here on the left-hand side is really what is the coverage of the surface water deliveries. TID being our predominant surface water purveyor within the subbasin, both spatially and from a volumetric basis. We can see that TID in general in the 2021 water year supplied at approximately 400,000 acre feet of water, as it's actually a mix of both surface water and groundwater due to their operations in the 2021 water year. In addition to that, here in the yellow, we see the Merced Irrigation District Northside Canal and some of their customers here in the yellow off of here in the east. And MID provides about 11,000 acre feet in 2021. In addition to that, we also have some what we're considering obviously significant, but some of the lesser surface water operations, and that's going to be some of the riparian water purveyors and riparian diverters off of each of our 3 major rivers here in the light blue, as well as some recycled waters related to the city of Turlock here in the purple, the city of Modesto providing some recycled water to some of this ranch land out here in the far west of the basin, as well as Hilmar Cheese and some of the recycled water reuse for agricultural lands that they use here. And so you can see that we're capturing about 17,000 acre feet of riparian diversions, as well as some recycled water at about 10,000 acre feet in the 2021 water year. In addition to really what is directly utilized at the farm gate, which is what some of the numbers that I presented in the previous slide, we also want to make sure that we capture some of the other impacts to the subbasin from each of these surface water deliveries. Really, we capture the whole picture of their operation. So in addition to their farm gate deliveries, you can also see here that we wanted to make sure that we quantify some of the canal and reservoir recharge. And so from that, we have we actually separate some of the seepage from the canal system from TID into what is considered the upper main, and then the predominant, the lower system. So we'll capture both and Turlock Lake. So we have both seepage and evaporation from their conveyance networks for TID, as well as Turlock Lake's seepage, and then Merced Irrigation District. In addition to their deliveries that I mentioned on the previous slide, we also have the canal seepage that occurs directly out of the Northside Canal as well. So then if we want to pivot a little bit over to some of the groundwater production. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, one of the things that we actually we know about our basin is going to be the production of what we're considering agency wells. And this is going to be predominantly by each of these water purveyors, which is going to be predominantly the 2 irrigation districts, as well as several of the municipalities throughout the subbasin. Effectively, that kind of due to the sophistication of some of these agencies, we are able to look at the per well, since most of these wells have meters on them, that we are able to simulate the production out of each well. So each of these wells have their own time series. We know the pumping depths that these wells are producing water from, and we can simulate that directly. And so part of this update includes both the extension of time series of these agency-based wells, as well as the addition of 2 new wells that went into production since the 2015 period that the previous model has covered. So if we want to take a quick look at really what does that agency pumping look like on a kind of on a volumetric basis, we can really see here on kind of the left-hand side, we see some of TID's, a combination of their drainage and rented wells. And we can see really the integration of that TID has on with their surface water delivery system, as well as the groundwater system. Specifically that we can see here in the, like, for example, in the 2016, 2020, and 2021 period, we definitely acknowledge that those are either dry or critical water years. And so because of the limitation of some of the surface water availability, we know, and we are also able to simulate the additional reliance on the groundwater system that the TID has for its overall operations. And so because of that, we can make sure that we reflect some of the increased production that the agency uses. In addition to, from the agricultural side of things, if we want to look on the right-hand side of this chart, we can see some of the urban agency-based pumping. Effectively, we can see each of the major municipalities within the subbasin, because they report because they directly report their groundwater production, we are able to simulate that in the model. And you can see here both the trends related to some of the conservation efforts that each of the cities have undertaken, predominantly in this 2005 through this 2015 period. We can see a lot of the conservation efforts that they've undertaken, which is why the water levels continue, or sorry, the pumping continues to decline over this period. And then we can see the continuation of that through the 2021 period. Obviously, though, we're going to see a little bit of growth in their overall demand and supply, simply related to increases in population. And so because
Dominic, I noticed that Waterford's not on here, or Hickman's not on here. Is there a reason for that? Do we not give you information, or is it not captured?
So Waterford predominantly being located in the Modesto subbasin isn't going to be included in this. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is
we have 2 wells in the Hickman.
Are they operated by Waterford and the city of Modesto? If so, they may.
The Hickmans are operated by the city of Waterford. There's
okay.
2 wells.
So yeah, so I apologize if they're not here. They're in this chart. They're definitely in the model for sure. I definitely know that we have those 2 wells in the production associated with them. Okay. So if we can move on to kind of the next step is looking at estimating particularly some of the private groundwater production in the basin. And really what we have here is a slide showing kind of the accumulation of both the reported metered wells and the estimation of private groundwater production, both agricultural and from an urban or what we consider rural domestic water users.
Dominic,
and so, yes.
Does that include the de minimis users?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Yep. Yep. So if we want to take a look at an approximate breakdown of what some of that pumping is, and this is actually specific that both this figure and some of the values associated with that we see on this slide are what is going to be directly reported to DWR through our annual report process. And so if we want to kind of walk through some of each of these volumes here, I'll give you a little bit of information, and predominantly that the 92,900 from agricultural agencies and the urban agencies of 34,400. Both of these are what is shown on the previous slide and they are direct, we're considering direct metered wells. On the other hand, when it comes to private, which is we have both agricultural private and urban private, which urban private is, as Karen was referring to, was our de minimis users, as well as any kind of smaller water groups that are not included in one of the major cities shown on the previous slide. And so we see about 9,000 acre feet from our de minimis users that we're estimating throughout the subbasin. And that's going to be predominantly estimated by the population of some of the rural areas throughout the subbasin. So overall, we can see that this estimation of groundwater production, a combination of both the agency-based pumping and the private-based pumping, overall we'll see the total of about 557,000 acre feet produced in the 2021 water year. And this on average is a little bit higher than what we would consider the average over the past 5 or 10 years or so. And that's actually predominantly going to be related to the fact that 2021 is a critical water year. And because of that, the supplemental surface water operations are there's less surface water. And so in order to meet our agricultural demands, we're going to see some more pumping throughout the subbasin as a whole. Now, if we want to take a look at this figure on the left-hand side, you can effectively see a heat map of pumping, and this is total pumping. So this will include both the agency wells that were shown in some of the previous slides, as well as our agricultural estimated private pumping. And so specifically when we look at the western half of our subbasin, or predominantly in the West Turlock GSA, really a lot of the dotted parts of the heat map are really going to be specifically driven by some of the specific wells of the agencies, and then to be able to supplement a lot of the surface water operations, as well as on the eastern half of the subbasin, or in the East Turlock GSA, we'll see that this is going to be predominantly focused into an area where there's high agricultural operations, as the East is predominantly, or is mostly reliant on groundwater, obviously omitting the Merced Irrigation District delivery areas. And then when we move to the kind of the far eastern section, it's predominantly native land and therefore has very little groundwater production in it. Okay, so if we want to take a look at now some of continuation of that last slide and look at some of the other modeling results. The first step we like to do when validating the model and seeing what we can learn from it is to take a look at some of the water budgets. So overall, if we want to take a look at the Turlock Subbasin land and water use budget, so again, this is simply a water use budget, which is what a lot of the information that will end up providing to DWR, effectively we can kind of see a continuation of the time series. For anybody who's been following with a lot of our GSP development, both this slide and many of the others coming will look very familiar to you. And what we actually see here is it kind of that continuation from the 2015 period on to 2020 through 2021. Now, predominantly when it comes to some of the agricultural operations and the agricultural water use here on the left-hand side, we can see that the end of the original historical period through 2015, we in the drought period, we always see a higher reliance on groundwater as opposed to surface water up here in the blue. And we can see that coming out of the drought, there begins to be more and more reliance on the surface water system, being that mostly we're looking at, we have a few wet years in here. And then again, in 2021, also being a critical year, we see a little bit more reliance on the groundwater system as well. And the pumping was an increase in pumping related to that. In addition, the other component we want to kind of draw your attention to, actually looking at the bottom of this chart, is looking at our overall agricultural demand. And again, when it comes to here, we can see a continuation of the overall demand. But if you remember, we have very similar land use as the 2015 period, but we do see that growth in our overall evapotranspiration. So we see two main components here. Is one, in some of these wetter years, during the early irrigation season, predominantly when we get some of our spring showers, spring precipitation, it lowers our overall agricultural demand. And so you'll see those being lower than if you would the agricultural demand in some of our more critical years or a dry year. And then also you'll see kind of just the general trend of our overall demand increasing, and that's going to be specifically related to the evapotranspiration. When it comes to our urban demand, this is very similar to the urban pumping figure that I showed a couple slides ago. And again, as a kind of a continuation, we see the demand being reduced due to a lot of the conservation efforts that the cities are operating under. And then, but that eventually we get to the point where as we come out of the drought, we kind of level off as far as a per person water use begins to kind of level off in the 2015 through 2020 period, but we do see continued population growth in each of these areas. And so because of that, we see a little bit of increased demand from each of the municipalities. If we want to break that up into the two GSAs, specifically looking at the West Turlock GSA, we see a very similar chart in that, but for agricultural demand here in the green, but we know that the West Turlock GSA is going to be more surface water reliant on their agriculture to meet their agricultural demands, and excluding and we see that little spike in both the drought of the 2013 through 2015 period, as well as the 2021 water year being a critical year. We have to rely a little bit more on our groundwater production rather than some of the kind of what we're considering some of the more standard years here in the middle. On the other hand, if we take a look at the East Turlock GSA, it's again a very similar story when it comes to the overall agricultural demand, but the East is going to be more groundwater dependent, barring some of the relatively small fraction of surface water availability from Merced Irrigation District. So if we want to take a look at our operational budgets, this is effectively kind of a vertical slicing of the groundwater model. Taking a look at really what is the direct impacts from the land surface system to the aquifer system as we kind of build our groundwater budgets. We've looked at these a lot and we discussed them a lot during the GSP, so I won't spend too much time on them for the sake of giving Liz an opportunity to cover her material as well. But overall, if we want to look at the subbasin as a whole, we can see that over the beginning of the historical period, in general, there was more deep percolation and recharge than there was groundwater production. And we can see that here in the first probably third or so of the water budget. When we want to look at our kind of the net values of what you see to the right, we can see that the overall in the kind of the 91 through approximately 2005 period, the basin overall was kind of a net contributor to the aquifer system if we want to look at everything vertically. And then as we continue to develop a lot of the lands throughout the basin, both the expansion of agriculture as well as the a shift into some more demand-driven crops, a lot of more permanent crops. We see the kind of the continuation or trending of relying more and more on the groundwater system overall. And so effectively the second half of this historical period, we can see that overall the basin is a net extractor from the aquifer system. And we can see the trend, particularly when it comes to the 2016 through 21 period, a continuation that the subbasin overall is a net extractor, although we do have periodic years like 2017 here. That was a very wet year. We have a lot of extra surface water in the basin. And because of that, we are actually a contributor in this 1 year, but overall the basin is maintaining its net extractor status. And again, if we want to look at the two GSAs kind of separately and be able to just kind of evaluate the operations and really see how that's really affecting the aquifer system, when we look at the West GSA, predominantly due to their surface water operations, ability to bring divert surface water, apply that water on our fields, and eventually percolate some of that water, we can see that the West is a net giver to the aquifer system, except in years, predominantly in critical years like 2014, 2015, and 2021, where the additional reliance on and additional groundwater production from those from both TID as well as some of the private agricultural users kind of flips the net recharge chart as being a net extractor in those few years. And then very similarly to the land and water use budget that we looked at a second ago, the East Turlock Subbasin GSA is going to be predominantly and fairly continuously a net extractor from the system. Again, this is going to be simply because we meet a lot of our agricultural demand with groundwater production rather than surface water supply. And so because of that, overall, or the net recharge, the East GSA is a net extractor. So if we want to take a look at the overall water budget, effectively what this does is this builds on some of the operational budgets that we looked at for the subbasin as a whole. Effectively, you can kind of see that the deep percolation in the green, pumping in the gray, and some of our canal and reservoir recharge in the purple. Effectively, those are all from our operational budgets. And again, that's like effectively just a slice looking at the kind of the vertical interaction from our land surface system to our groundwater system. But if we want to take a look at some of the other factors that affect our aquifer system, specifically related to subsurface flow from the adjacent areas, in this case, which is going to be predominantly from the three subbasins surrounding the Turlock Subbasin, we can see that overall our subsurface flow is going to be a net inflow from our adjacent subbasins of a magnitude of approximately 15,000 acre feet a year on average, as well as looking at our stream interaction in the blue. Now we have had a lot of discussion on our stream interaction as a potential undesirable result under sigma, and we can see the continuation of that. We've discussed a lot about getting to this influx point where overall the subbasin as a whole has been a net giver to the stream system through kind of up till a point where about that 2013 through the 2015 drought, at which point now we are looking at that we are a net extractor from the stream system and inducing additional stream seepage to help support the groundwater levels within the basin and the overall storage within the basin. But given that we are reporting to DWR for the 2021 water year, we can see that overall, the overall pumping, which is our predominant outflow out of the basin, is this 557,000 acre feet. We actually kind of went over that on a few slides ago, looking at that pumping heat map. In addition to that, that pumping is offset by some deep percolation. That's going to be both from precipitation and applied water, the canal and reservoir recharge. And effectively, overall, if we want to add all these up, we can see that the overall change in storage for the 2021 water year is about 295,000 acre feet of decline in groundwater storage. And again, this 2021 is a fairly irregular year in the fact that it is another critical year where there's less surface water available and increased groundwater demand. Overall, if we want to take a look at the cumulative change in storage, looking at this kind of black line, we can see the kind of effective continuation of a lot of the trends. This is related, going to be very heavily driven by our operational water budgets that we looked at and the net recharge of the system. And we can see that increased demand is driving an overall decline in water levels throughout the subbasin. But one of the things I did want to kind of point out, particularly as we look at this kind of the last 6 years of the simulation related to this annual update, we can see that we actually do have a decent amount of recovery coming out of the last drought, the 2015 drought, and through 2016-17, we, to a degree, level out for a few years, and we actually recover a decent degree. But again, this 2021 being another critical year, as our overall change in storage again is beginning to get on a dip. We're hoping, and it's kind of effectively just one of those unfortunate natures, I guess, in that a lot of the conversation as we pulled together the GSP had to be the discussion related to the 2013 to 2015 drought and a lot of the impacts that we saw there, and then the kind of the nature of our first annual report is being 2021, another critical year. We see decline in storage again there. And so, but overall, I want to say that even though that some of these numbers for the 2021 water year look pretty rough, overall, over the past 6 years, we've at least stabilized to a degree. So the next step in the validation is going to be looking at our groundwater hydrographs. This is the idea behind this, is to get an idea of how well the model is representing that change in storage as reflected by looking at groundwater levels. Basically, we've through the GSP, we've developed a monitoring network, and so we have effectively put that monitoring network in the model, and we can take a look at really how the model compares to those water levels and that we see from observed data, how the model is simulating those. And so I am going to go through these kind of quickly, but if you have any questions or would like to see them, please feel free to stop me. So the first well here, as you can see, is going to be on the western part of the subbasin. And again, I'm probably going to move predominantly from west to east, and so that we can kind of get an idea of some of the water levels across the basin and really how the model is comparing them. So what we can see is that the observed data are going to be all the little black dots. Those are specific readings at a given time, and the model, because the model does simulate in a continuous nature, you're going to see a line of what the model effectively is representing. And then in addition to here, just to kind of support to kind of get your own frame of reference, we have included the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, but that is going to be really more secondary to the validation stage here. So we can see at this well here, we're tracking it fairly well. You can see a little bit of a dip in the 2015-2016 period that this specific well doesn't capture, but overall we're capturing this well fairly well. As we kind of move here a little bit to the south, but still staying on the west, you can see that the actually observed data is only is fairly recent, a fairly recent monitoring well. You can see data is really only begins in 2014 or 2015 or so, but that overall the model is still capturing it. Same as we kind of move back, and this is kind of similar to the series area. Really, we can see that we're capturing both the trends and the overall water levels fairly well. Again, the 2015-2016 period, we see a little bit of a spike that the model isn't quite capturing to quite the extreme, but to a degree, there is a kind of a limitation of the model that is going to be kind of really specifically related to some of the spatial discretization. Really that, again, that going back to that element size, that sometimes we're just not simply able to really capture some of the more localized results. And really a lot of our goal when looking at some of the hydrographs from a modeling perspective is to kind of make sure we really capture the overall trends, looking both kind of on a longer time period rather than kind of specific localized conditions or readings. Moving a little bit further to the east here, again, in the south, we can see that overall that the trend is, we're kind of capturing much of the trends. We can see that the high points, and then in fact, in contrast to the previous, we actually have in that 2016 period a bigger decline rather than what we're seeing here in the observed data. But again, overall, the trends are really what we're focusing on here, even if we're underrepresenting the observed data to some degree, that overall the general shape of the impacts to the aquifer system are being followed fairly consistently. So now moving again further east, I think at this point we are almost, actually we're right on the boundary, not quite, this is a TID well, not quite in the East Subbasin GSA. But again, the same thing, we can see a little bit more of an overall decline in water levels comparatively to some of the others that were further to the west, but that we are overall, the model is capturing the overall conditions fairly well, particularly in the extension period, this 2016 through 2021 period. Moving a little bit further, now we are in the looking at the East Turlock Subbasin GSA well, specifically one that's kind of related up here in near Turlock Lake. We can see the overall decline in groundwater levels. Again, the model is slightly underrepresenting the groundwater levels. But if we look at kind of the long-term trends and really the capture of the impacts that we're seeing is that we're fairly happy with this result in that it captures the kind of the long-term trends, captures the general decline and degradation of groundwater levels. If we want to move a little bit further south over here, but still looking on the east, again, this is a fairly new well. This one actually only has readings probably from 2019, 2020 forward, but we can see that we are still capturing those water levels well, which is always nice to see, given that even if we don't have water level data kind of towards the beginning. And again, this is one that is really, this one and the next couple are going to be really focused as we're getting closer to the Merced River, as this was a kind of a critical area during the GSP. I wanted to make sure that I showed a couple of wells here. So very similarly, kind of continuation of that, again, another new well. This is a Merced River monitoring well. And so again, this East Turlock Subbasin GSA well 17, being focused in adjacent to the Merced River, we can see that overall we are capturing both kind of a general trend of it. We have declines where we would expect declines and kind of a leveling out here in the late 2020, 2021 period. We see that in both the observed and the simulated data. And then again, another Merced River monitoring well, kind of in the further sections, further eastern sections of the subbasin. We have Eastern Well 21. And again, slightly underrepresenting the absolute value of the monitoring well, but still generally capturing the trend. And in fact, this is actually, well, I don't think I have it. But one of the other kind of three wells you see here are show a very similar trend. And again, this was really what comes back down to is really related to the resolution of the grid and our ability to capture localized conditions. Whereas this one is actually slightly underestimating some of the observed data at a well immediately adjacent. We actually see the inverse of this, where the model is again showing similar trends, but is actually slightly overestimating. And so that just comes back down to one of the limitations of a model, simply due to its resolution and its ability to capture localized conditions. So then the final component that we need to show and present to DWR is our overall change in groundwater storage. So for overall change in groundwater storage, to DWR, we have to provide both a map by principal aquifer. And so we'll take a look at these overall subbasin first here, and that map has to be provided to DWR as part of our annual report, as well as providing the overall volumetric delineations of storage reductions in the subbasin and by principal aquifers. So overall, before I dive into the specific principal aquifers, kind of the overall thing that we can see here, specifically looking at decline in storage in the 2021 water year, is going to be that we are seeing a continuation of growth of the cone of depression that is kind of in the central to eastern central section of the subbasin. But one of the things that we're seeing, and that is also backed up both by the modeled and observed hydrograph, is that predominantly in 2021, we're actually seeing more of a lateral growth of that cone of depression rather than a deepening of that cone of depression. And that's really what you're going to see here. We can kind of see that arcing here of that cone of depression growing horizontally. And that's where we're seeing some of this change in storage. Now, the other component to that that you're going to see both in this and in the following couple of slides is the change in storage is going to be focused in on the western side. We actually see a decline in storage very heavily in the far corner of the subbasin along the San Joaquin River. This is actually going to be predominantly not entirely, but heavy factor of that is going to be some of the subsurface flows in the Delta Mendota subbasin. And so we've seen declines, pretty significant declines in water levels in Delta Mendota. And so the model is effectively simulating that subsurface interaction between the two subbasins. And so we see declines in storage on underneath the San Joaquin River, predominantly being that we have more water moving to the west to our neighbors. But then that overall, the rest of this hotspot is going to be simply due to the fact that it is the 2021 water year, again, as I mentioned, is a critical water year. We have less surface water availability, predominantly in the Western GSA. And so because of that, we're going to see declines in water level and due to the additional reliance of pumping in specifically the 2021 water year. So overall, we see the subbasin is losing about 300,000 acre feet of storage across the entire subbasin. And then that is broken up into about 160 in the Western Principal Aquifer and about 120,000 in the Eastern Principal Aquifer. So if we want to get an idea of the breakdown for that, we can see that in the Western Principal Aquifer, the Upper Western Principal Aquifer. This is going to be higher changes in the storage you're going to see here. This is what's going to be more driven by surface water availability in the West. But then when we look at the Lower Principal Aquifer, these declines in overall storage are going to be, again, really more focused on or more heavily driven by the subsurface flow between us and our neighbors. And then if we want to look at the Eastern Principal Aquifer, again, as I mentioned earlier, we start to see an expansion of the Kona Depression horizontally. And that's why you're going to see this change here kind of as you get further and further away from the centroid of that Kona Depression. But then again, you'll also notice that there is a lighter color here right along the river. And that's going to be because the river seepage and some of the stream depletions being induced along the Tuolumne River. That water is effectively in the river system is effectively shoring up, acting as like a little bit of a barrier for the continued change in storage. And so we're having some slight additional depletions along the Tuolumne River, which is going to kind of shore up the water levels and shore up the change in storage, which is why you kind of can see that little bit of a buffer just to the north of each of these two colors. Okay, so I know I went through a lot. So if we want to take a look at our next steps, in the immediate future, our goal is to submit the annual report to DWR. So I've gone over most of the input data and some of the results. We do have to provide groundwater budget information to DWR, specifically relating to surface water deliveries, groundwater production, and change in storage. And so all three of those and that form of water use will be provided in the annual report and in the form of tabular data to DWR. Those are ready, and I believe to the group for review, and we are finalizing that now, and we will submit it this upcoming week. In addition to that, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there were some items that we will try to take a look at after we submit to the annual report. And as far as additional refinements and improvements to the model, that is specifically going to be relating to kind of closing the loop on the land use and cropping patterns, as I mentioned earlier, related to some of the data that is publicly available from DWR, comparing that to the data that is available from Stanislaus and Merced County, as well as TID also has their own records. And so kind of effectively working those 4 different data sets out and really seeing really what's the best way to represent the last few years, reconciling that data now that if we have a little bit more time after the annual report, the goal will be to reconcile some of those conflicting data sets and refine the model there. In addition to that, we also have the potential goal to refine surface water operations. This is going to be specifically related to estimating canal and reservoir seepage. I know that for their agricultural management plans, both Turlock and Merced irrigation districts have been looking at different ways and improvements to their estimation of seepage and canal losses to the aquifer system. And so we are considering potentially improving those, and as well as really this last component, which is to take a look at interbasin flows, and this is really going to be specifically focused on additional coordination with some of our neighbors. As you can see, change in storage we have with Delta Mendota. There's at least some additional coordination that we need to work out with them related to some of the water levels, as well as continued coordination and interaction with both Modesto and Merced, as we all do affect one another. And it's just really important for us to make sure that all of our neighbors and us are on the same page. And so we are hoping to work with them more and really just refine some of the innervation flows and the conditions that the model simulates across some of the different subbasins and really improve the model the best we can. And then once those are reconciled, the goal is to reevaluate model calibration and see if there's anywhere specifically that we can improve. And if there are any kind of critical areas that we have specifically relating to overall groundwater sustainability, and if there is any additional data, any additional calibration of parameters that we can do. Really just our goal is to make the model the best tool that it has the opportunity to be. So with that being said, is there any questions for me, or is there anything that the group would like to discuss? If not, I can happy to pass it on back to Liz.
Thank you for that, Dominic. That was really very thorough and complete, and a great understanding of recent trends in the subbasin. Any questions for Dominic at this point? Okay, hearing none, I'll hand it back over to you, Liz.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dominic. I am going to share my screen and go through the rest of my slide deck. Okay, so the first kind of goal here is just to kind of discuss some of the analyses that we did apart from the model. And the first is hydrographs. I'm going to go through a bunch of different hydrographs. Many of them are actually very similar, are the same wells that Dominic just went through, which I think is helpful because you'll see that trends in groundwater levels were captured really well by the model, as Dominic showed. And then also we'll see some patterns between kind of the change in storage and the climate and the precip over the last 6 years. And the trends are mirrored on the water levels, not surprisingly. So what did we do? We updated almost 50 hydrographs for representative monitoring wells, RMWs, and I'll be using that acronym. RMWs are the wells that are in the GSP monitoring network that we just submitted to DWR a couple months ago. And the GSP had an appendix with all of the hydrographs. And so what we've done is we have updated those hydrographs with recent water level data. And those updated hydrographs are in our annual report as an appendix. In water year 2021, most of the water levels were at or above the minimum thresholds, the MTs. But there were water levels that were below the MTs. In the monitoring network for chronic lowering of water levels, there were a total of 12 wells that whose water levels were below the MTs. 2 of those wells out of 18 were in the western upper principal aquifer. 1 out of 8 wells were in the western lower principal aquifer, and 9 out of 21 were in the eastern principal aquifer. There were also wells with water levels below the MTs for the interconnected surface water monitoring network. Total of 6. 4 of those were along the Merced River, 2 along the Tuolumne, and 3 wells that are along the San Joaquin River were all above the MTs. And so again, this is a good time to remind the group, like this reporting period, water year 2021, came before we started managing the subbasin, before the GSP was adopted, before the monitoring network was even fully developed. So we don't expect that DWR is going to hold this against us. And we are just moving forward into the future, and we will have more data to analyze and look at for the next annual report. So I'm going to march through a few hydrographs through the subbasin. The map in the lower right and the red dot shows you where we are. And this first well is in the western upper principal aquifer. This is TID 48. And these are all representative monitoring wells in the monitoring network. And so what this hydrograph shows is that since the drought, water levels have recovered in the Western Upper Principal Aquifer, at least not fully, but pretty close. They're not quite as high as they were before the drought, but they've recovered. But in the last couple of years, the last two water years, water year 2020 and 2021 were very dry. And so we're seeing water levels fall again. They haven't reached historic lows, but they're falling. The next hydrograph is TID 136. This is located again in the Western Upper Principal Aquifer, close to the edge of the Corcoran Clay. And its trends are pretty similar to the last hydrograph I showed you. The water level recovery isn't quite as high, but there is recovery. But we have now, kind of gone to the other side of that recovery peak. The recovery has been arrested by the dry couple of years that we've had the last couple of years, and water levels are declining. This is TID 175. This is in the Eastern Principal Aquifer. And similarly, we're seeing slight declining trends since the drought. We did have some recovery, but since the recovery, it's been kind of steadily but gradually, water levels have been declining. Moving further east, this is ETS GSA 06. We're seeing that the water level declines are more pronounced to the east. I've circled, I didn't point this out earlier, but in each of these you've seen a red circle, and that is I'm circling the data that was measured in water year 2021. So in water year 2021, in this well, water levels declined about 5 feet. Moving further east again, this well, ETS GSA 02, which is adjacent to Turlock Lake, to the east of the lake. Again, declining trends are increasing to the east. During water year 2021, this hydrograph shows that water levels declined about 14 feet. And, it could be, we know that this is an active domestic well. So the question is, was it pumping? It may have been, we're not sure, but that could be the reason for this pretty big decline that we're seeing, not only in water year 2021, but before then also. This is ETS GSA 14, shifting now to the southern portion of the subbasin. So between about spring 2020 and spring 2021, water levels decreased about 10 feet. But in water year 2021, the red circled area, water levels actually increased about 8 feet. So we're seeing seasonal fluctuations in this well pretty dramatically. And it could be because it's being affected by nearby pumping. And this well, ETS GSA 21, in the last couple of years, from October 2019 to September 2021, water levels declined about 21 feet. During water year 2021, the net decline was about 2 feet. So not a huge change during this last water year, but declining trends over the last couple of years. So we've also compiled groundwater elevation contour maps. We've developed 4 new maps based on data at the representative monitoring wells and also additional Sigma wells. We produced maps for 2 different time periods for water year 2021, fall 2020 and spring 2021. And for each time period, we have 2 maps, one for the Western Upper and Eastern Principal Aquifers and one for the Western Lower Principal Aquifer. And you'll see that we don't have a lot of data for the Western Lower Principal Aquifer. So these maps are post maps because we just don't have enough for contours. And one thing that we did for the annual reports, which was really helpful, which we weren't able to do for the GSPs because we got the data at different times. But for these annual reports, since we had the water level data for both the Modesto and Turlock subbasins, and we're working on the annual reports for each of those at the same time, we contoured the groundwater elevations for both subbasins at once. And it really helped us understand what the contours should look like along the Tuolumne River. So you'll see those contours coming up. So this is the fall 2020 groundwater elevation contour map. This has wells in the western upper and the eastern principal aquifers. You'll see that the regional groundwater flow is to the west and the northwest. Groundwater elevations range from about 119 feet mean sea level in the east at this well here, to about 45 feet mean sea level in the west at this well here. And in the center of the pumping depression, it reaches an elevation of about 30 feet below sea level. So you can see the cone of depression here, which is drawing water in from the east and also drawing some water in from the eastern portions of some of the western portions, no, the eastern portions of West Turlock Subbasin GSA. So we have some water flow this direction, and we obviously have very steep gradients going into the pumping depression. There is a groundwater mound in this region of the subbasin, the southwest region of the subbasin near the Merced River. And in the western subbasin, generally, flow is to the northwest, kind of down gradient out of the subbasin. Moving on to the fall 2020 map for the western lower principal aquifer. We only have data from one well during this reporting period, one representative monitoring well, and that is the Ceres Smyrna Park multi-completion well here. So needless to say, there's not enough data to contour. We have constructed additional monitoring wells in the western lower principal aquifer using Prop 68 grant funding from DWR. Those were constructed just recently between December 2021 and I think February. They were finished just a month ago. So these wells will be really valuable for us in the future. And they will be part of the representative monitoring well network. The GSAs are also planning to construct additional wells in the subbasin, and the western lower principal aquifer is, clearly an area where we could use some more wells. Moving on to spring 2021 for the western upper and eastern principal aquifers. So the flow patterns, the contours, relatively similar to fall 2020. There was some water level recovery, as you'd expect from fall to spring. On average, for the wells that were on both maps, both the fall and spring maps, there was an average increase of 2.4 feet. Most of this increase was seen in wells in the eastern principal aquifer. So the average increase for wells in the eastern principal aquifer was about 4 feet. And the wells in the western upper principal aquifer were pretty stable. The change was actually on average decline of 0.1 feet, but basically that means it's the same. So we had an increase in water levels. On average, most of those water level increases happened in the eastern principal aquifer. But again, the flow patterns are quite similar. And this is our western lower principal aquifer map for spring 2021. We have a few more wells on this map, total of 4. Still not enough data to contour. The Smyrna Park well was on both maps, and it's the only well that we can use to compare. And in that well, water levels declined about 2 feet from fall to spring. The other 3 wells that are on this map are multi-completion wells. 2 of them are in Turlock, 1 of them is in Denair. And groundwater elevations in these other 3 wells ranged from 32 to 36 feet mean sea level. So they were relatively similar to one another, which is good to see. And yeah, so we will have more data to show at in the next annual report about what's happening in the western lower principal aquifer. And again, DWR understands this because we developed these monitoring networks before the GSP was, this annual report is being compiled with monitoring network wells that were developed before the GSP was finalized. So our maps in the future will look more complete in the western lower principal aquifer. So another thing that we did for this annual report was we did a pretty robust water quality analysis. We followed the methodology that was described in the GSP. What we did was we downloaded historical water quality data from the GAMMA database through the GeoTracker for our 6 constituents of concern that were identified in the GSP. And those constituents of concern are arsenic, nitrate, uranium, TDS, 123 TCP, and PCE. So what we did is we developed 6 different maps, and I will show you a couple of them, that show all of the wells that were measured for these constituents of concern during water year 2021. So basically the wells that were sampled for these chemicals during our current reporting period. And the maps, as you will see in a second, we are plotting the maximum concentration that was measured at each of these wells during the historical period. And that historical period is the historical GSP study period from 1991 to present. So what we're doing here is we're developing a baseline for a baseline water quality analysis, which will allow us to evaluate future changes in water quality. So for example, in the second annual report, the water quality data that we download for water year 2022 will be compared to this baseline to see if any new exceedances of the MCLs are occurring. And so we will use this baseline in the future to see what kind of water quality changes are occurring in the subbasin. And then if there are new exceedances of MCLs, we'll be looking at those new exceedances to see if they could be a result of any of the projects or management actions that are being implemented in the subbasin. So that is the purpose of this first analysis. It's a baseline set of data. And so I'm going to show you a couple maps. This is the map for arsenic. And again, in the annual report, there are maps for each of the 6 constituents of concern. This one for arsenic. There are 3 different panels, as you can see. The upper left is for wells that are screened in the western upper and eastern principal aquifers. Upper right is for wells that are screened in the western lower principal aquifer. And the lower left are wells that are screened somewhere in the western principal aquifers. And there are 2 categories of wells that are on this map. One is wells that where we don't know the construction data. We just have no idea. So we don't know which aquifer it's in. The second category are wells that have long screens that intercept both the western upper and western lower principal aquifers. So they're in both aquifers. So we can't differentiate, and so they're on this map. And so again, what these maps show are all of the wells that were sampled for arsenic during water year 2021. And the color coding is based on the maximum concentration that was detected during the historical period from 1991 to present. So in water year 2021, 113 wells were measured for arsenic in the subbasin, and those are the wells shown on these maps. The historical maximums are shown on these colors. So there are 4 different color categories on this map and also the next map. The color categories are consistent. So if the historical maximum of arsenic at a certain well was non-detect, then that well is black, and there are no cases of that on this. In other words, none of the wells sampled for arsenic in water year 2021 had a maximum concentration of non-detect. In other words, all of these wells had a detection at some point since 1991. The green dots mean that the maximum concentration was a detection, but that detection was below the MCL. And the orange and the red dots are showing wells that have had maximum concentrations that are above the MCL. The orange dots are between the MCL and twice the MCL, and the red is twice the MCL. So for arsenic, 64% of the wells shown on these maps, the historical maximum was less than the MCL, and 36%, the historical maximums are above the MCL. So 36% of the wells that were sampled in water year 2021 at one point during the historical period, or more than one point, had a historical maximum greater than the MCL, the orange and red dots. And most wells that exceeded the MCL were public supply wells. And it should be noted that the data that we have for the public supply wells are the groundwater concentration. So it's before treatment and before blending. So it does not represent what customers are drinking.
Liz, I think that's kind of an important consideration, because oftentimes people get this information and say, 36% of the water I get exceeds the arsenic MCL, right? And that's the kind of information that groups get and it sticks in their mind. So we have to be careful there. And I think the historic period, back then the MCL was 50 parts per billion for a long time. It went down to 10. Did you take that into account, the change in the MCL, or are you just taking it 10 parts per billion MCL?
Yeah, we used the current MCL. We compared all the data to the current MCL.
Right.
Yeah, so we do realize that there are changes of the MCL through time.
Yeah, I was working Turlock at the time. We had a number of wells that were like 15, 20 parts per billion, and that was consistent with the MCL. And then the MCL changed, they were shut off immediately. So no one ever received water that exceeded the MCL. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and so no, that's a really good point, Michael. Thank you. And again, like you said, it's an important point that this is the water this is not the water that is being delivered to customers. This is the water that's coming out of the ground. And the consumer confidence reports for the municipalities are probably the best place to check for quality that's reaching customers.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thanks.
If you included raw water somewhere, that would help also. Because that's what we call it when we're doing our water sampling, the raw water versus treated.
Yeah, but this, I believe this is the raw water, right? I mean, do you mean when you say raw water?
Like how you could put a little footnote,
Oh, I see.
Raw water source is not necessarily the water you're drinking.
Got it. You're saying that to use the term raw water for what I'm trying to explain. Yeah, that would be a lot more elegant than what I tried to do. Thank you. Yeah, I will note that. Thanks, Karen. Okay. I will move to the next map. Whoops, this is for nitrate. So in water year 2021, there are 318 wells that were sampled for nitrate. Again, the historical max measured between water year 1991 and the end of water year 2021 shows that 71% of the wells that were sampled in water year 2021 had a historical max that were less than the MCL. So those are the orange and the black dots. And about a third of those wells have historical maxes that are above the MCL, the orange and the red dots. And the elevated concentrations, as you can see on the maps, are primarily in the Western Principal Aquifers, as well as the Western region of the Eastern Principal Aquifer in this area up here. Moving on to TCP. In water year 2021, TCP was measured in 110 wells. 55% of these wells had historical maximums that were less than the MCL, and 45% had historical maxes that were greater than the MCL. So 45% of the wells on this map are either orange or red dots. In fact, mostly red dots. All of the TCP detections were at public supply wells. And again, I'll use Karen's term, raw water. So this is not the water that is reaching customers. Does anybody have any other questions about these maps before I move on? Because this is the last map that I'm going to be showing. No, okay. Okay, so we also looked at subsidence during water year 2021 for the annual report. So the water year 2021 land subsidence data is based on DWR INSAR data. This is the same data that we relied upon for the subsidence analysis that we did for the GSP. And what this map shows, all of the gray, the light gray and the dark gray are areas where the vertical displacement is actually positive, meaning ground surface elevations rose or are stable. And so most of the subbasin, the important take home, the most important message here is that throughout most of the subbasin, there was no land subsidence. Where we do see land subsidence is this kind of yellowish color, yellowish orange in the western subbasin. This shows that during the water year 2021, the vertical displacement was between 0 and 0.05 feet, which is 0.6 inches, which is minimal, very, very little, and is actually very similar to the rates that we were seeing in the GSP for the analysis of the GSP, which was over, I think, 4 or 5 years. So there's minor land subsidence happening. We don't see a change in the rate. We don't see that this is causing problems with critical infrastructure. So we are not terribly concerned about this. But it's something that we will continue to keep our eye on. Each annual report, we will look at the new data and see what we find. And you also notice on this map, there's a bunch of areas that just don't seem to have data, and that's because they don't have data. For some reason, the INSAR data is just not continuous throughout the whole subbasin. And I can't explain why. I'm not really sure, but that's what that means. There's no data in those areas. So the remaining annual report schedule, we are almost to the end. We are currently revising the draft report based on comments that we got from the tax. We are shooting to have a final report ready next Monday, the 28th. And next week, we will be submitting it to DWR. It's due next Friday, the 1st. So that is where we are at, almost done. And anybody have any questions?
Ken, thank you, Liz. I mean, that's a lot of information in 45 minutes or so, but again, similar to what we've seen as we put the GSP together, ongoing trends, and then with the last couple of years of another drought, so close to the other significant drought, we see that reflection in the groundwater levels, hydrographs, and contour. So no surprises there, and obviously it's a concern, but the way I'm looking at it is, we're working towards sustainability, and we haven't had a chance to implement many of our projects and management actions yet. So it's not great, it could be worse. And I think over time it will get better. So thanks for everybody for your work on that. Do you have any more questions for the consultant team? As you'll note on your agenda, this actually is an action item because we do need to submit this report by the end of next week to DWR to stay on their schedule. Is there any concerns with passing the report as submitted? I know there's a couple of comments, but generally the report as presented today, does anybody have any concerns with it? I know a number of people have been working behind the scenes on edits and stuff. I'm not hearing much feedback, so that's good. So with that, there is a recommended action by the West Turlock GSA first to approve the GSP annual report and recommend it be submitted to the Department of Water Resources. Does anybody want to make that motion for the West Turlock TAC?
Make the motion.
Second, Waterford.
Okay, so that sounds like Miguel Alvarez from Modesto and a second from Mike Picklock from Waterford. Any other further discussion? Okay, and this is a motion, not a resolution, so we can do a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, that motion stands approved. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, we need to get the same motion from the east side to recommend to submit the annual report to DWR.
This is Matt. I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Matt. Can I get a second?
I'll second, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis. I'll do a roll call. Matt,
Yes.
Dennis,
Yes.
Lacey,
Yes.
Christy,
Yes.
and Sarah, yes, passes.
Okay, thanks everybody. And thank you, Liz and Dominic and your teams for your hard work on that project. Okay, moving on to item number 8, monitoring event. This is our first monitoring event since we had a GSP. This is the March 22 monitoring events. It's just an informational item regarding what happened or has been happening over this last week or two as we've been monitoring the subbasin. So Karen from the West Turlock and Mike Tietze from the East Turlock are going to take this one on. So thank you guys. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you everybody for submitting your water levels. It went very smoothly. There was only a handful of wells that we needed to collect on the urban side, so it was pretty easy. So hopefully we'll get to see the results of the AME flight soon.
That's good. Mike, anything for the East Turlock?
I don't have much to report except that monitoring is in progress, and I believe it's going to be wrapped up early next week.
Wonderful. So thanks you guys for coordinating and timing it. So I went along with the AEM flights that are around about the same time. So there's a little bit of overlap and better calibration there. So that's exciting. Okay, any questions on the monitoring we've been doing? Thanks everybody from all the different agencies for getting your information into Mike and Karen. We do appreciate that. Okay, so item number 9, Sigma related updates. This is an opportunity for us to discuss general Sigma related items. I have a few, but why don't we start with Herb? You want to go first on communication and outreach?
Sure, Michael. I just have a couple quick items. So things have been pretty light on communication and outreach thus far, obviously, as you might expect with submitting the GSP at the end of January. But one thing that is of note, we sent some social media posts out in the beginning of March because it was Groundwater Awareness Week nationally. So we kind of piggybacked a little bit on 1 or 2 tweets that the Department of Water Resources sent out one of our own, pointed people to some of our previously produced materials. And then the second item related to the AEM surveys, I, as wearing my TID hat, had the opportunity to be interviewed in Fox 40 segment. They talked to DWR as well, and then they Zoom interviewed me as well. And I answered questions about how the data will be helpful for various GSP efforts that we're undertaking as a subbasin, and talked a little bit about that. And so that was an opportunity to get the message out as well about that event, which I understand is obviously still going on as well through, I want to say in our area, maybe not so much our subbasin, but at least in our area through mid-April, the segment in which we're doing that. And you guys have heard about that before through Karen and others. So those are the only 2 things I can think about thus far. We'll just continue to find some ways to get some information out on social media, and then continue to use our email newsletters as we get information as well. So I think that's about it. Also, maybe it could be worthwhile at the next meeting, I'll try and remember to provide a little bit of an update related to some things that might be going on just in the legislature related to Sigma laws. I know there's a couple things that are out there being tossed around, so I might be able to provide a little bit of an update on that too. But that's it for me.
Thank you, Herb. And Debbie's gone, so she passed along some updates. On the AEM, they have started flying this part of the San Joaquin Valley. And in fact, I can report I was in Fresno near Friant on Saturday morning, and the helicopter flew right over me. It was quite breathtaking. It's pretty darn low, and it's a big boom they have on the bottom. And I was the only guy in the group who knew what it was. So felt pretty smart that day for once. So that is going on, and we look forward to getting those results. Second, on the grant side of things, the Prop 1 grant, which is the grant we used to pay for the plan for the GSP. Once we get the final invoice from Todd for February and the final GSP expenses, we're going to kind of finish that up and do a final reconciliation. So that's good news. And on Prop 68, we're funding 3 projects under that. First is the monitoring wells. So all the wells in the east and west have been installed, and we're waiting for the final report from Wood Rogers, and then that will be final payments made and closed out. The GRAT, the final training was completed and now is available for use by the GSA member agencies. And then the programmatic environmental impact report, continue to work on that. There's a subgroup of us working on the first couple of chapters, a number of technical memos, which kind of set the framework and the thresholds for the EIR. So that's moving ahead fairly well. So those are my items from Debbie. Any questions for me? Okay, hearing none, move on to our final thing. Is our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, April 28th. And with that, I will take a motion for adjournment from anybody from the West Turlock GSA. Having so
motion, Mike.
Thank you, Miguel.
I'll second.
Okay, we got a motion from Miguel, a second from Karen. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, West Turlock's adjourned at 3:40. Sarah?
Thanks. Can we get a motion to adjourn the East Turlock?
I'll move, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis. A second?
I'll second, Lacey.
Oh,
Thanks,
and I got
Lacey.
one more thing before everybody leaves. But anyway, you can adjourn. This is just a notification to everybody.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
carry on, Sarah. Sorry.
We didn't let you adjourn properly?
Well, it's not, we're not taking action. So just to remember that people on the West Turlock GSA, you got an email from Jennifer. The West Turlock Tech will be meeting once a month, starting in April. And so you get that information. So every year from the West Turlock, we have West Turlock only GSA TAC meetings fairly soon, starting in April. Okay, sorry to butt in on you.
Okay, sorry. I'll do a quick roll call for the East Turlock and then we can adjourn and I think we'll cover everything. Dennis?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
Lacey?
Yes.
Christy?
Yes.
And Sarah, yes. And we are adjourned as well. Thank you all very much.
You want to take care?